There is a Sunday morning in October 1723. A 17-year-old boy steps off a boat onto the docks of Philadelphia. He is wearing dirty work clothes. He has been traveling for days. He knows exactly no one in this city. In his pocket, $1 and a copper shilling. That is everything he owns in the world. He is hungry, so he walks into a bakery and asks for 3 pennies worth of bread. The baker gives him 3 large, puffy rolls, more than he expected, and because his arms are already full with the small bundle of everything he owns, he tucks 2 rolls under his arms and walks into the street, eating the 3rd. A young woman named Deborah Reed watches him from her doorstep and thinks he looks absolutely ridiculous. That same day, he walks into a print shop and asks for work. He gets it. That boy is Benjamin Franklin. And I want to tell you how this particular moment came to be, because the escape to Philadelphia is not the beginning of the story. It is the consequence of a childhood spent in circumstances that would have broken most people before they ever got the chance to run. Franklin was born in Boston in 1706, the 15th of 17 children. His father, Josiah, was a tallow chandler. He made soap and candles. It was honest work. It was not prosperous work. Josiah scraped together enough money to give Benjamin 2 years at Boston Latin School, where the boy excelled immediately and completely. Then the money ran out, and at 10 years old, Benjamin was pulled from school and put to work in his father's shop, cutting wicks and pouring molds. Think about what that meant. 2 years of formal education, total. Everything else, and I mean everything, he would have to build himself. At 12, his father apprenticed him to his older brother James, who ran a print shop in Boston. The indenture was for 9 years. 9 years of legally binding servitude to his own brother. And James, by Franklin's own account, was not kind about it. Franklin later described his brother's treatment as harsh and tyrannical. But the print shop gave him something his father's candle shop had not. It gave him access to books. He wrote in his autobiography, "From a child I was fond of reading, and all the little money that came into my hands was ever laid out in books. And when he ran out of money to buy them, he worked a scheme. He befriended the apprentices of booksellers, borrowed their books in the evening, read through the night by candlelight, and returned them before morning so no one would notice they were gone." This is a 12-year-old boy, teaching himself in the dark. In 1721, James founded the New England Courant, a newspaper. Benjamin was 15. And here is where you start to see what kind of mind this boy actually had. He wanted desperately to write for the paper. He knew James would never allow it. So he invented a character, a middle-aged widow named Silence Dogood. He wrote 14 satirical essays in her voice, sharp, funny, genuinely sophisticated, slipped them under the print shop door at night, and watched as his brother published them to public delight, having no idea his teenage apprentice had written a single word. I love this so much. He could not get in the front door, so he built a secret door. When the Dogood letters made him the talk of Boston, and his identity was finally revealed, James was humiliated. And a humiliated older brother with legal authority over you is a dangerous thing. The abuse got worse. The relationship became intolerable. And so Franklin made a decision that took real courage. He ran. He broke his indenture, which was not just a breach of contract, it was a legally punishable act, and he boarded a ship in secret. He was 17 years old. He was a fugitive by the laws of his colony. He arrived in Philadelphia with dirty clothes and 3 rolls and $1 and a shilling. What I keep coming back to when I think about this moment is the nature of the bet he was making. He had no connections, no money, no credential, no sponsor, no family in this city. He had broken the law. He was, by every external measure, starting from less than 0. But here is what he also had. He had spent 5 years in a print shop learning a skilled trade. He had spent 5 years reading every book he could get his hands on. He had spent 5 years writing, secretly, obsessively, getting better without anyone knowing. He had, in other words, been building himself the entire time he was being used. The brutal apprenticeship under James did not break him. It equipped him. And the moment he walked into that Philadelphia print shop on a Sunday afternoon in October 1723 and asked for work, the compounding began. So here is this 17-year-old kid. He has walked into a Philadelphia print shop on a Sunday. He has no references, no connections, no money to speak of. He has a Dutch dollar and a copper shilling. And he gets hired. What happens next is one of the great self-construction projects in history. Because Franklin did not wait for someone to educate him. He had already decided years earlier that if education was going to happen, he was going to have to build it himself. And the method he used to do that, the specific, deliberate method, is worth understanding in detail. He found a volume of The Spectator, Addison and Steele, the best prose writers in the English language at that time, and he reverse-engineered their work. He would read an essay, make brief notes summarizing the argument, then set the notes aside. Days later, he would try to reconstruct the essay from scratch, in his own words, and then compare his version to the original. Then he would find his faults and correct them. Then he would do it again. He did this over and over until his prose could hold its own against the models. That is how the Silence Dogood letters got written. That is how a 15-year-old apprentice, setting type for his brother's newspaper, secretly wrote 14 essays so good that the paper published every single one of them without ever suspecting the author was the boy downstairs. He taught himself, completely. Arithmetic that his formal schooling never covered, grammar, navigation, French, Italian, Spanish, Latin. He describes borrowing books from booksellers' apprentices at night, reading through until dawn, and returning them before morning so no one would notice they were gone. From a child I was fond of reading, and all the little money that came into my hands was ever laid out in books. That is the foundation. Not talent, not connections. Books. And a relentless refusal to stay ignorant. Now he is in Philadelphia. He is starting to build a reputation as a skilled printer. And what I find so fascinating about this period is how consciously he managed his own image. He understood something that most young people never figure out, that being good at your work is necessary, but not sufficient. You also have to be seen working. He writes about this directly in the autobiography, and I love the strategic clarity of it. He says, "I took care not only to be in reality industrious and frugal, but to avoid all appearances of the contrary. I dressed plainly. I was seen at no places of amusement. I never went out a-fishing or shooting. A book, indeed, sometimes debated my time, of which I had always a few at hand." He was not going to the tavern. He was not going fishing. He was at the press. And then he goes further. He describes personally hauling paper supplies through the streets on a handcart, work he could have delegated or avoided, specifically so people could see him doing it. I was seen going and returning with my little handcart, thus showing that I was not above my business. Think about what that is. That is a young man who understands that reputation compounds, that every person who sees you working hard updates their model of who you are. He was building credit, social credit, professional credit, one visible act at a time. The frugality ran just as deep. He had reduced his own diet at one point during the apprenticeship years to save the food allowance his brother paid for his board, pocketed the money, spent it on books. He was not depriving himself accidentally. He was making a deliberate trade. Short-term comfort for long-term capability. He understood, at 17, that he was the asset. Investing in himself was the highest return investment available. And it was working. Within a few years, he had his own print shop. Then he acquired the Pennsylvania Gazette and turned it into the most widely read newspaper in the colonies. Then came Poor Richard's Almanac, published every year for 25 years under the pseudonym Richard Saunders, filled with the compressed, practical wisdom he had been accumulating since he was a boy reading by candlelight in Boston. Dost thou love life? Then do not squander time, for that's the stuff life is made of. Lost time is never found again. Beware of little expenses. A small leak will sink a great ship. These were not decorative sayings. They were the operating principles of a man who had built himself from nothing and was now encoding that process for anyone willing to read it. By his mid-20s, Franklin was the most successful printer in the colonies. He had started with a Dutch dollar and a copper shilling. He had educated himself in secret, in borrowed time, on borrowed books. He had worked visibly and saved aggressively and written constantly. And he had done all of it with a plan. Not instinct, not luck. A plan. I have always thought that one man of tolerable abilities may work great changes and accomplish great affairs among mankind if he first forms a good plan and, cutting off all amusements or other employments that would divert his attention, makes the execution of that same plan his sole study and business.
That was not a theory for Franklin. That was autobiography. So Franklin has already taught himself to write by stealing hours from sleep. Already built the most successful print shop in the colonies through sheer, visible industriousness. He's done all of this alone. And now, at 21 years old, he asks himself a question that most people never ask at any age. What if I didn't have to do this alone? In 1727, Franklin founded the Junto. He called it a club for mutual improvement. 12 members, a surveyor, a cobbler, a clerk, a glazier, working tradesmen and artisans, men of modest means but sharp minds. They met every Friday evening, and what he built in that room was, I think, one of the most underappreciated institutions in American history. Here's how it worked. Every member was required to come prepared, not just to show up, to contribute. Franklin devised a standing list of questions that opened every meeting. Real questions, hard questions. He recorded them in the autobiography. Things like, do you sincerely declare that you love mankind in general, of what profession or religion soever? Do you think any person ought to be harmed in his body, name, or goods for mere speculative opinions or his external way of worship? Do you love truth for truth's sake? I love that. Before you can sit down, before you can benefit from this group, you have to declare where you stand. You have to commit to something. Franklin was building a culture from the very first sentence. And then the discussion itself. Morality, philosophy, science, business, civic affairs, whatever mattered. And the rule was that members had to argue their positions with humility, without dogmatism. Franklin specifically trained himself during this period to stop speaking in absolutes. He writes about this in the autobiography. He had read the Socratic dialogues young and adopted the habit of framing his opinions as, I conceive, or, it appears to me, rather than declarations. He says this made people far more willing to actually hear what he was saying. The Junto met for 40 years. 40 years. The same institution, the same Friday evening ritual, running continuously as Franklin went from a 21-year-old printer's apprentice to the most famous American alive. But here's what makes this truly extraordinary. The Junto didn't just sustain itself. It multiplied. It compounded. The members shared books. Book ownership was expensive. The collection grew, and Franklin, being Franklin, formalized it. He proposed that the group's shared books become the foundation of a lending library, open to subscribers beyond the Junto itself. In 1731, the Library Company of Philadelphia was born, the first subscription library in America. He was 25 years old. He says in the autobiography that reading was then so fashionable that our people, having no public amusements to divert their attention from study, became better acquainted with books, and in a few years were observed by strangers to be better instructed and more intelligent than people of the same rank generally are in other countries. He built a library, and then he watched the intellectual level of an entire city rise. This is the pattern. Franklin didn't just improve himself,
He built structures that improved everyone around him, and then those structures ran without him. The Junto produced the Library Company. It produced proposals that became the Union Fire Company, the first volunteer fire department in America, founded in 1736. It produced conversations that led to the Pennsylvania Gazette becoming the most widely read paper in the colonies. It produced the American Philosophical Society in 1743. It produced the Academy that eventually became the University of Pennsylvania. Every single one of those institutions, still standing, still operating. You can walk into the Library Company of Philadelphia today. The American Philosophical Society still meets. The University of Pennsylvania just celebrated its 275th anniversary. Franklin built things that are still running nearly 3 centuries later, and the seed of almost all of them was 12 working men meeting in a room on Friday evenings when he was 21. Walter Isaacson, in his biography of Franklin, makes a point I think about often. He writes, paraphrasing here, that Franklin's genius was not just scientific or literary or political, but fundamentally social. He understood, earlier than almost anyone, that the collective intelligence of a well-organized group exceeds what any individual can produce alone. Franklin understood leverage. Not financial leverage, human leverage. The multiplication of self through institutions, through networks, through structures that keep producing value after you have left the room. And so the Junto was not charity. It was not altruism in some vague sense. It was a system. Franklin was doing for civic life exactly what he had done for his own character. Identifying what worked, formalizing it, creating accountability, and then repeating it until the results compounded beyond what anyone could calculate at the start. Lose no time. Be always employed in something useful. Cut off all unnecessary actions. That was one of his 13 virtues. Industry. He lived it. But the Junto was something deeper than industry. It was the insight that the best use of your time is sometimes building something that allows other people to use their time better too. He was 21. He knew no one in Philadelphia 5 years earlier. And now he had built a machine for collective human improvement that would outlast him by centuries. That is not luck. That is a plan, executed without distraction, exactly as he said. So we come to the most personal thing Franklin ever did. Not the library, not the fire company, not the newspaper. Something smaller, and in some ways more radical than any of it. He decided to engineer his own soul. He called it, without any irony, the bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection. And that sentence alone tells you everything about who this man was. Most people accept their character as something that simply happens to them, shaped by circumstance, by mood, by whatever impulses show up that morning. Franklin looked at his character and said, "No, this is a construction project. I am going to build this the way I built the print shop, with a plan, with materials, with daily measurement." He identified 13 virtues, wrote a precise definition for each one. Then he built a small booklet, 1 page per virtue, 7 columns for the days of the week, 13 rows for the weeks of a quarter. Every day he would mark any violation of a virtue with a small black dot. His goal was a clean page, no dots, perfection. And he did not try to work on all 13 at once. That's the part I find genuinely brilliant. He focused on 1 virtue per week, cycling through the full list 4 times a year. His reasoning was exact. I judged it would be well not to distract my attention by attempting the whole at once. That's a man who understood how attention actually works. You cannot optimize 13 things simultaneously. You pick one, you watch it, you move to the next. It is the same logic he used to teach himself to write, by reconstructing Addison and Steele essay by essay. Focused repetition. Deliberate practice before anyone had a name for it. Look at some of these definitions and just sit with how precise they are. On temperance, eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. On silence, speak not but what may benefit others or yourself. Avoid trifling conversation. On industry, which we talked about before, but here he crystallizes it into a single sentence. Lose no time. Be always employed in something useful. Cut off all unnecessary actions. And then there is the one he placed last. Humility. He put it last because a Quaker friend told him, plainly, that most people found him proud. And Franklin, to his credit, did not argue. He added humility to the list, and noted that he was never quite able to achieve it in any genuine sense. But he worked on at least projecting the appearance of it. And then, in one of the most self-aware lines he ever wrote, he acknowledged that even taking pride in your humility is still pride. He could not escape it. He knew it. He wrote it down anyway. On order, which he found the hardest, he was equally honest. He admitted he had started too late, that his excellent memory had protected him from the consequences of disorganization for too long, and that he never fully conquered it. Order, too, with regard to places for things, papers, etc., I found extremely difficult to acquire. This is what I love about the whole project. He was not writing a self-help pamphlet. He was not performing improvement for an audience. This was a private booklet, and the entries were often dots, violations, failures. He kept the record anyway. Because the point was never the clean page. The point was the looking, the daily honest accounting of who you actually were against who you had decided to become. And here is what it produced. He wrote near the end of his life, "On the whole, though I never arrived at the perfection I had been so ambitious of obtaining, but fell far short of it, yet I was, by the endeavor, a better and a happier man than I otherwise should have been had I not attempted it." Read that slowly. He failed at the goal. Completely.
He never hit moral perfection. And he is telling you that the attempt itself transformed him. That the gap between who you are and who you are trying to become is not a source of shame, it is the engine. There's something in Poor Richard's almanac that fits here exactly. Search others for their virtues, thyself for thy vices. That is the entire 13 Virtues project in one line. Most people do the opposite. They forgive themselves and judge others. Franklin built a system to reverse that instinct, to turn the critical eye inward systematically every single day. He kept this practice for years, decades. The little booklet wore out from use and had to be replaced. He transferred the grid to ivory pages so he could erase the dots and start again. Think about that image. A man so committed to the daily examination of his own character that he literally wore the pages out. Poor Richard also says, "'Tis easier to prevent bad habits than to break them." Franklin knew this. The whole system was designed around prevention, catching the small violation before it calcified into character. A dot on Monday means you correct on Tuesday. Leave it unmarked, and it becomes who you are. And threading through all 13 virtues is the same conviction that powered everything else he built, that a human being is not a fixed thing. That you can decide what you want to become, build a system around that decision, work the system honestly, and actually get there. Not perfectly, but meaningfully, measurably. He started this project as a young man with almost nothing. He carried it forward for the rest of his life. And what it quietly produced, beneath the inventions, the institutions, the diplomacy, was a character capable of doing all of it. And then there's the part of this story that I think gets lost, because we end up focusing so much on the lightning rod, the bifocals, the keelless boat, the postal routes, that we forget what all of that came from. It came from a kid who ran away at 17 with almost nothing and decided, before he had any evidence that it would work, to build himself into someone worth becoming. By the time Benjamin Franklin died on April 17, 1790, 20,000 people lined the streets of Philadelphia for his funeral. 20,000. The largest public gathering in American history to that point.
The man who arrived in that same city 67 years earlier, eating a bread roll in the street, unknown, broke, technically a fugitive.
That man was mourned by a nation. Think about what actually happened in those 67 years. He negotiated the Treaty of Alliance with France, the diplomatic achievement that made American victory in the Revolution possible. Without France's military support, the Continental Army almost certainly loses. Franklin is the reason the war was winnable. Then he negotiated the Treaty of Paris, ending that same war. Then he walked into the Constitutional Convention at 81 years old, the oldest delegate in the room, and helped hold the whole thing together. And he did all of it with a mind and a character that he had built himself, by hand, from scratch. Walter Isaacson, who spent years studying Franklin's life, wrote that his genius was as an organizer of people and as a crafter of compromises. And I think that is exactly right, because the skills that made him the most effective American diplomat of the 18th century, the patience, the self-command, the ability to read people, the willingness to suppress his own ego for a larger outcome, those were not talents he was born with. Those were the virtues, the ones he worked on every single week with a small booklet and a grid and honest black marks. Think about what it takes to negotiate an alliance with the French court. You are an old man from the colonies, speaking a foreign language, navigating one of the most sophisticated and treacherous political environments on Earth. You have no army behind you, no credible leverage. All you have is your reputation, your wit, and your ability to make other people trust you. Franklin had spent 50 years building exactly those things. Not accidentally, on purpose. He understood something about power that most people miss. He writes in the autobiography about disarming a political enemy in the Pennsylvania Assembly, a man who openly disliked him. Instead of confronting him or flattering him, Franklin simply borrowed a rare book from his personal library, then wrote him a gracious thank you note. The man was warm toward him for the rest of his life. Franklin drew the lesson cleanly. He that has once done you a kindness will be more ready to do you another than he whom you yourself have obliged. That is a man who understood human nature at a level that most people never reach. And he reached it the same way he reached everything else. By paying attention, by reading, by testing ideas against reality, and by being honest with himself about what the evidence showed. His last public act, and I love this about him, was signing a petition to Congress for the abolition of slavery. At 84 years old, barely able to leave his bed, he still had one more thing to push for. He never stopped. Right up to the end, he was still trying to do something useful with the time he had left. Thank you for listening to the story of Benjamin Franklin. If you'd like more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment on who you'd like to hear about next.